Hello. Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. Vice President, EIBA Fellows, chairs and co-chairs of the various tracks, EIBA members, authorities, colleagues, and friends. Welcome to the Complutense University of Madrid and to the 47th EIBA 2021 conference. Back in December of 2018, I presented our first bid and proposal to organize this conference. At the EIBA board meeting in Poznan, I remember quite well that moment. 3 years later, that bid is finally paying off. And thanks to COVID-19, this opening plenary is taking place a year later than expected. But in any case, here we are together at last. We are together at last. Over the next 2 days, we'll be missing some of our colleagues from EIBA community who finally decided not to travel to Madrid due to the pandemic. But I think that despite all delays and absences, the program we have in store will prove very interesting and worldwide. Let me introduce 3 main ideas very shortly. The first one is that the pandemic is no longer a topic for the historian discipline. It is an issue of urgent relevance for most and perhaps all socio-political and economic fields. And this is why also the EIBA conference is interested in these 3 days to talk about that. We have seen how governments worldwide for nearly 2 years have reacted and tried to contain health problems, but also have they defined and have to contain economic and social impacts. One of the consequences of these varied strategies applied by governments has been that practitioners, but also academics, we have to think about. And we have seen how public-private relationship is now a topic. It is a topic that we will discuss during these 3 days. Second, the digitalization of productive activities have shown also the potential in terms of communications and how communications has resolved in some part our distance from our workplace, our distance from family and friends, how even leisure and consumption has changed due to thanks to telecommunications and digital technologies. And thirdly, the general disruption that has been caused by the pandemic adopted many forms. One of the issues that we also are interested in is on the reconfiguration of global and regional value chains, and how we can combine this with the geopolitical tensions, the present geopolitical tensions, which is also our interest to study and to explore of. In that particular moment, we observe how both multinational companies on the one hand and small and medium enterprises on the other are dealing with these new changes. But please let me now, with great pleasure, to give the floor to Nadia Calviño, first Vice President of the Government of Spain and Minister for the Economy and Digital Transformation of our country, We very much appreciate that she has accepted our invitation to be the keynote speaker for this opening plenary of the 47th EIBA conference. And in this moment, I would like to also say that congratulations, Vice President, for being the European candidate for the position of Chair of the International Monetary and Financial Committee. Vice President Calviño, the floor is yours.
Gracias, perdone. Muchas gracias, querida Isabel, querido Andrés, dear John. Thank you very much. Good evening to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's a great pleasure to go back to having at least partially present event like this one. It's the first time I participate in this event, but I am aware of the importance, the role that this academy plays in the advance of academic knowledge in the field of international business, which is a subject really crucial to our understanding of today's driving forces. Firms have become active players in the transformation of our economies to a more inclusive, fair, and sustainable world. All our efforts in the areas of the green transition, of the digital transformation, spin around companies. And so I think it is very useful, it is really key that we have this kind of events and debates on the role of businesses as innovators, investors, and producers, game changers. In general, I was reflecting as I was coming here this afternoon, companies, but also governments and citizens in general, have been suffering these unprecedented 21 months, which have been extremely hard for all of us, which I think have put all of us to the test. But after these very hard times, we are at a key moment. It's really a crossroads to decide how we want to shape the economic recovery, how we want to shape the economic cycle that is starting right now. We are at the moment of high uncertainty, but it is in these times when it becomes more important than ever to look at those elements that can give us some confidence when we're looking ahead, when we're looking to the future. And I think there are reasons that should give us some comfort and confidence when looking ahead. From the depths of this unprecedented economic and sanitary crisis, we have managed to avoid a major catastrophe and return our economy to growth thanks to a swift vaccination campaign and an ambitious set of well-coordinated economic policies. Isabel, you have already referred to it. It is so important that we have coordinated ourselves at the European, but also at the global level to try to provide effective responses on the health, the economic, and the social front. And when I was entering this impressive auditorium, which is called after Ramon y Cajal, one of the greatest men of science of this country, I was thinking what an incredible miracle it has been to have the vaccine at this record time. We have carried out the vaccination process very effectively, and that has proven to be the best remedy against the health, but also against the economic impact of the pandemic. In Spain, as you know, we're very close to 90% of the population fully vaccinated. This is a collective success, a proof of the capacity of our public health system, but more importantly, it's a proof of the solidarity and responsibility of the population. Citizens have been a great example, I think, throughout the whole pandemic. And together with the vaccination process, we have implemented for the past 21 months an unprecedented also set of economic policy impact-driven measures to protect what we had, which has proven to be much more efficient and cheaper than letting things be destroyed and then having to rebuild from scratch, as happened in previous financial crises. Our analysis is that thanks to these very ambitious set of measures, we have avoided a destruction, a drop above 25% of our GDP. More than 3 million jobs would have been lost. A global financial crisis would have been unleashed, I think, and a tremendous damage to our society and our productive sector. So it's good that we have managed to have a coordinated response on the economic front, very ambitious set of measures with a very large fiscal impact. We have been bearing in mind also fiscal discipline when looking ahead and trying to ensure that as soon as possible we can go back to a downward trend of our deficit and debt to GDP ratios to ensure that moving ahead we are also building back our fiscal space and so providing better opportunities for future generations. But the truth is that in only 15 months, more or less, we have managed to recover pre-pandemic employment levels, in contrast to the 12 years that it took for us to recover after the last financial crisis. So, of course, when we look ahead, that we will find bumps in the road, and there are challenges, and I know you're going to be discussing these in and out in the coming 2 days. Starting with the new variants of the COVID virus that are appearing, and are going to, of course, put us to the test again. But what really matters is that we have left behind the worst of the pandemic, that the economic recovery is underway, that all evidence suggests, in the case of Spain, that our country will be one of the engines of growth in Europe in 2022 and 2023. And what we need to ensure now is that this is not just a temporary rebound, but a strong, sustained, and sustainable recovery. And to this end, we have an unprecedented opportunity which is the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan. In the case of Spain, we will be able to mobilize up to 140 billion euros in public investment, and therefore to mobilize, to trigger a much larger amount in terms of private investment. And in parallel, we will be implementing a very ambitious program of structural reforms. Concerning investment, many times people ask me, well, these amounts, they are really incomprehensible. How can we imagine 140 billion euros? But those that are familiar to structural funds, and I know Andrés is one of the greatest experts we have in this field, know that this amount is more or less what Spain has been receiving in structural funds since we joined the European institutions. So, looking back and acknowledging what we have achieved with these investments over 3 decades, imagine what we can achieve if we invest this money properly, in the right manner, in the right areas, from now until 2026. I think that this gives us an unprecedented opportunity to invest in human capital, to invest in this green transition, in science, in research, in the modernization of all our infrastructures, the real economic and social infrastructures that are the basis for potential growth, productivity, and prosperity looking forward. This is an unprecedented opportunity we cannot miss, and that is why Spain is the country that's most advanced in the implementation and the deployment of the plan. As you probably know, our plan places a special attention on the green transition and the digital transformation. Around 40% of investments will be devoted to this green transition, around 30% to the digital transformation, together with education, vocational training, science, innovation. These are the areas where we want to put our money in the coming years. Together with the investments, we are going ahead, moving ahead as fast as possible and actually accelerating in the second part of the year this very ambitious reform program. There are many important pieces of legislation that have been passed or are in the process of being approved, having to do with the climate change, for example, the energy transformation. But I would like to just mention a couple of initiatives that have to do precisely with creating the right business climate, so improving entrepreneurship, investment, and talent. The public attention in Spain is very much focused on labor market reform, and actually we will be pressing ahead with this labor market reform with a clear idea of implementing it by year end, and so having a legal certainty and a new framework that will create high quality jobs going forward as of 2022. We're very advanced with pension reform. But we have also pressed ahead with 3 pieces of legislation that are important, that cover the whole business cycle of companies. Only last week, we passed the draft law Crea y Crece, that's for the creation and growth of companies, in order to try to enhance and improve the demography of companies in Spain, which is a country marked by the high weight of micro-enterprises, self-employed workers, SMEs. So it is a quite ambitious piece of legislation to reduce red tape, to facilitate the creation of a company as of €1, also to fight belated payments, which are hindering the growth of SMEs. Today, in the government's meeting this morning, we have approved also a draft startup law, which is a crucial project to try to boost entrepreneurship in this new digital economy, also attracting investment and talent to our country. And I hope that in the coming weeks, we will also adopt the draft insolvency reform, which is then covering the whole business cycle, as I was saying, trying to facilitate and to modernize the structure of our economy, trying to promote entrepreneurship, but also a more dynamic, more efficient, more flexible business environment. We're very committed to this reform agenda. We're also very committed to this investment agenda, because all our actions are oriented towards a very clear objective, which is supporting a strong economic recovery, job creation, but also the modernization, the transformation of our economy, so that this unprecedented challenge that was the pandemic is also an unprecedented opportunity to try to build a better future for future generations, for the next generations, such as you, the younger persons in the room today, those that are joining us around the world through this web streaming. And this is a very ambitious program which requires the help of everybody. Public administrations, social partners, but also the corporates. And this puts in the forefront a point that Isabel made, with which I would like to close these initial remarks, which is the importance of public-private partnerships. The importance that we all row in the same direction, that we try to mobilize public and private investment in the same orientation, alongside the European green and digital agendas, because if we are ambitious, but if we are focused and determined, and if we all row in the same direction, I think that we will succeed in this endeavor. Spain is an example of success. Since democracy came to our country, we have really exceeded the most positive expectations about how the country would evolve, would develop, and prosper in the new political environment. And I think that once again, we will be an example of success if we all act in the same direction, if we take the best and we work together to profit from this unprecedented opportunity. I'd like to close my remarks on this positive idea so that we give the right spin to the debates that you will be having. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to address you today, and I wish you a very productive event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Calviño, for this keynote speaker. And now it's my pleasure to introduce, as a second speaker, Andrés Rodríguez Pose, who holds the Princesa de Asturias Chair and a Professorship of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics, where he has taught since 1995. He also holds a part-time chair in innovation at the University of Stavanger, Norway. And at the London School of Economics, he was director of the Department of Geography and Environment. He has also been president and vice president of the Regional Science Association International and vice president and secretary of the European Regional Science Association, ERSA. He will be looking at the global pandemic from the point of view of economic geography, speaking on the ultimate effects that we might plausibly anticipate from COVID-19 at both the macro-geographic or interregional and micro-geographic intraregional levels, as well as what diverse results might be expected and when considering lockdowns and the residential, occupational, and leisure preferences of different populations. Andrés, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here at EIBA. Madam Vice President, dear Nadia, dear friends, dear colleagues, I've been asked today to talk about the implications of COVID and what COVID might have for cities and regions, mainly across Europe, but this can be applied to many parts of the world. And I'm going to start by highlighting that until relatively recent, until March 2020, we had a territorial model that had become the dominant model over the last 3 decades. And the territorial model was the one that you have over there, to your left, I think, which was one in which many large cities across the world were steaming ahead. They were attracting investment, they were attracting talent, they were concentrating economic growth, and this dynamism of large cities was, to a certain extent, creating some resentment, some discontent, that in many parts of the developed world, but also in many emerging countries, was highlighted by the emergence of anti-system, let's say, populist parties, and sometimes outright violence. Then, overnight, our lives were changed. They were turned upside down by the pandemic, and what we had, this is the impact of the pandemic in the case of Europe at regional level during the first 6 months, in which the main targets of the pandemic, the places where we had the biggest impact, the biggest incidents, were those that mainly were the ones that had been steaming ahead, namely the large cities. As you can see there, places like Madrid, but also Lombardy with Milan, places like Paris, London, Stockholm, they were the hardest hit by the pandemic. So that led many to think this is a game changer, that we're going to come out of a pandemic with a territorial model that is going to be different because cities have lost out. The picture of Dublin there that you have to the right during the lockdown with people leaving places like New York in droves. And what we're going to have is through this successful experiment on remote working, on teleworking, that this represents an opportunity for medium-sized cities, for towns and rural areas that had been losing beforehand and now have a much greater chance to grow. This is something that, how it was perceived. However, if we take a longer look at the pandemic, and this is the impact of the pandemic between January 2020 and the end of June 2021, what we see is that the impact has become more territorially indifferent. It's no longer concentrated in cities. We have some countries that have done notoriously well out of the pandemic, the case of Norway, where the excess mortality was lower than the previous 5 years. But in other cases, what we have had is that excess mortality has been somewhere in between 10% and 30%, at least in the case of Europe. The pandemic has represented, in many ways, a significant change and has been propelled by what I consider are 3 main forces of change. The first one is the social scarring that the pandemic is leaving at the moment and is likely to leave on quite a significant part of the population. This might be, for most of us, hopefully temporary, but for a smaller percentage, I hope very small, is going to be long-lasting, even lasting our life for the whole of their lives. This is mainly caused by the fear of contagion, the fear of interacting with others, which is very often triggered by prolonged periods of being in lockdowns, have been in quarantines, and the equivalent. Another force of change is the need to maintain social distance, that we think periodically that we can get out of it and then we have to go back to it after a while, but this is leading to an adaptation of our built environment, both in the way we live, in the way we interact, but also in the way when we go to a restaurant, when we go to a cinema, these are norms that are likely to remain for long. But the biggest change, and for me, the biggest transformation is the acceleration of trends that were already in place, the idea that we were going towards a digital transformation, more teleworking, teleshopping, e-commerce, that was thrust into our lives suddenly for us in Spain on the 14th of March 2020, in other countries more or less around that period. And suddenly, overnight, we have learned to shop online. We have learned to work from the comfort or discomfort of our homes. And we have learned in many ways to socialize, to have conferences, and I'm very glad that this is a face-to-face, in-person conference through a screen. So the squares of a Zoom connection. And that has implications. What you see there below, the sign of e-commerce, is a city in England not that long ago. That is in November 2020, just a year ago, in which if you have companies like Amazon that are growing at 40% per annum in terms of sales, just in the case of Europe, you have others that are losing. And in many parts of Europe, retail, local retail, has lost about 5% over the last year. This is problematic because although we all love the comfort of e-shopping, we are talking about a company that has a large monopoly of the e-shopping, that has grown in terms of employment massively. Before the pandemic, it had 800,000 workers worldwide. Now it has gone to, it's growing every day, but 1.2 million, 1.3 million. But we have a retail system, a retail sector in Europe, which including retail and wholesale, employs 32 million people. And when you end up with boarded shops on the mainstream, this is what my colleague Richard Flores is calling the retail apocalypse that is coming in many of our cities and towns. We have had empty offices. And the funny thing is that not a lot of us are going to return full-time to the offices. We're going to have part-time work, not part-time work. We're going to have hybrid systems in which many of us will go and work in the office 20, 30, 40% of our times, and the rest is going to be done remotely. So probably this is going to lead to less of a need of office space within our cities. And if you have more e-commerce and less need of office space, more remote working, you're going to end up with a situation whereby the demand for leisure in certain spaces, restaurants, theaters, cinemas, culture, sports arenas, etc., is going to dwindle and is probably going to dwindle hard. This is creating this situation. For many, it was seen with hope. I mean, the pandemic has had a horrific toll. No one can say that anything can come out of good of this. But it also represented an opportunity to reverse this process of concentration of economic activity in certain places. The idea that we could all leave New York and go and work from the Hamptons or from the Hudson River Valley or go to Miami and Florida and do it, or in Spain, we could reverse the whole concentration of economic activity in Madrid, to a less extent in places like Barcelona or the Basque Country, in favor of what is known as the empty or emptied Spain, was something that actually put a lot of people thinking, yes, this is an opportunity that we need to take because we are going to be able to work in places where the cost of living is lower, where we're going to have a better quality of life, and where we're going to enjoy overall a better life. Unfortunately, I think that this is a lot of wishful thinking. We're starting to get numbers, I was going to say after the pandemic. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, so we cannot really say it. And what we're seeing is that many cities are recovering, and they are recovering faster. Places like New York, that was hard hit by the pandemic, is much more dynamic, whereas many of the places that were thought that were going to benefit, first, there were few and far between. They were mainly anecdotal, and the ones that were doing well were the ones that were doing well before the pandemic. Many of these medium and small-sized cities are not doing particularly well. So what we're likely to have is perhaps also because a large percentage of the people that can work remotely are, and are going to work hybridly from now on, are in the most dynamic places, normally the big cities. So probably what we're going to end up is with a situation which is more or less the same as we had before in this terms of macro geography, with a greater divide between dynamic cities and less dynamic, with exceptions, of course, medium-sized cities, town and rural areas, and that we can kiss goodbye this idea that the pandemic is going to solve the problem of concentration, the problem of territorial divide that is creating this polarization within our societies, unless we implement, and hopefully with the next generation funds, we'll be able to implement more adequate policies that would make these places not just more attractive, but also dynamize and utilize the talent that is available virtually everywhere, despite the fact that they have lower opportunities at the moment. Where we're probably going to see more changes, and where we are already seeing more changes, is at the level of the microgeography of cities, what's happening within our cities. We're starting to see now that the real estate market has boomed, but it has boomed particularly in the suburbs of cities to a much far greater extent than in the inner cities. We have this sort of donut effect. We're starting to see that, unfortunately, for the the green transition, that whereas public transport is in most large cities in the developed world at well below levels, pre-pandemic levels, car traffic, automobile traffic has picked up and has recovered to the same level, so people are still in fear of taking public transport. And we're seeing that movements have transformed from being radial movements from the periphery to the center to movements that go in all directions in our cities. So what we're likely to have is probably much more dynamism in the suburbs, in places, not just in the suburbs, but perhaps a bit further away, that are within easy access to the big cities. Probably we're going to see, because of this less use of retail space, or less need of retail space, less need of office space, perhaps less need of leisure space, a transformation of city centers, which offers an opportunity. I mean, it would have a transition period in which we might need to adapt, especially bigger cities might need to adapt somewhat, the inner cities, but it offers an opportunity for other people, other activities to move into those cities, and it would depend very much on the city, and we need to think about how we do it. The pandemic has created, as I said before, a lot of grief. But from this grief, something better can come. The only thing is we cannot hope that it's going to come without us working hard for it, without putting the effort to put the right policies at all levels, at the local, at the regional, at the national, and in the case of Europe, at the European level. And if we start thinking about new ideas, new forms, if we start thinking hard about how can we make our cities much more attractive, how can we make our regions much more attractive, how can we mobilize talent that is inherent to everyone, wherever they are, if we don't do that, we are for a rough ride. Hopefully, I'm optimistic, and I do think that if we implement the right policies, if we grab this opportunity with both hands, if we use the next generation funds to the best of our ability, we can have a far better future in which we have not just a more dynamic world, our cities and regions are more dynamic, but they are also far more sustainable, far more resilient, and better places for all of us to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrés, for this very interesting presentation. And the next speaker is the EIBA Fellow, Professor John Candwell. I will invite you to go to the micro when you like. Professor Candwell, we all know very well in the EIBA community, is Distinguished Professor of International Business at Rutgers University in New Jersey, to whom the Complutense University, this university has newly conferred a much-deserved honoris causa doctorate. It was yesterday, in fact. He has been a fellow of the Academy of International Business and also of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in the United Kingdom since 1998. John will be discussing today how the form taken by globalization in the information and digital age has enabled certain cities to benefit more than others from increased international connectivity and knowledge, his main field of research. Those global cities that are playing a central role in the generation of innovative solutions for sustainable development must necessarily connect with other, which we call less central regions in new and restructured ways. So Professor Candwell, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you very much. So Andrés and I didn't coordinate at all, but actually what I have to say is quite complimentary, I think, to his remarks on recent trends in urban geography and economic geography. Perhaps to preface my remarks, to set it now in a more sort of international business context that will be familiar to colleagues here, as we've moved into the information and digital age over the last 30 or so years, 40 years, away from the previous paradigm of Fordism, mass production and the science-based age, to now increasingly information-based, knowledge-based types of society, and the critical role of knowledge connectivity. So, for instance, foreign direct investment trends that have shifted away from purely market-seeking, local market-seeking objectives to increasingly pursuing the objectives of knowledge-seeking and knowledge connectivity. And hence, for example, if we look then at the location or the region or the city, we observe that increasingly what matters is not just what is locally geographically bounded within the place, but the extent to which that place can become connected with others successfully and therefore engage in international and domestic business networks. So those are really where my remarks will be based, taking account of some of the trends that Andrés has indicated, although I don't have anything to say about the pandemic. Some of the data I'll be showing you in a moment is from work with Salma Zaman, who's a recent doctoral student of mine, now relocated to Lahore in Pakistan. And in a paper that we published in 2018, we looked at the relationship between networks, innovation networks within cities, within major international cities, and their international connections, innovation connections, and we found a positive relationship between the two. In other words, we found, as I've already been hinting at, that it was those cities that were more internationally connected that were most dynamic and were doing best with respect to domestic business and innovation structures too, local clusters of activity. This is quite contrary, for example, to the kinds of work that was sometimes, or arguments that one found commonly in the previous mass production age, for example, the work of somebody like Beccattini in Italy, who was focused very much on the purely local and the small and medium-sized enterprise as a key element of a cluster dynamic. What we were finding was instead that multinational firms were playing a critical relationship to other companies as network partners and as nodes in networks, providing connections. So that we see knowledge-seeking globalization being linked, therefore, to local knowledge networks and becoming part of the advantage of a location. Consequently, what we were observing is that there was a shift in trends towards, and this, of course, is also quite well known among economic geographers these days, but more widely, I think, in political circles, that there has been a growing inequality within societies, but it's translated into a regional, geographic inequality, that globally connected cities have been doing much better than lesser known cities, and indeed, of course, non-urban areas, rural areas, areas especially that have relied more on traditional types of resource-based, natural resource-based development, because these have often lacked the knowledge connections across space that have become so important. And indeed, often the hinterlands of the major cities have become somewhat more disconnected than in the past. So what we find, for instance, this is a chart now taken from a paper we published recently, myself and a couple of economic geographers, Max Bacoltz and Harold Bertelt, in the Journal of International Business Policy, in which we were looking at trends over time in the extent of convergence or divergence across major urban areas, in this case in the United States, but we see similar patterns in Europe too, in which essentially what happens is you observe a kind of convergence and catch-up in the previous mass production paradigm that had been happening for quite a long period of time through to the early 1990s, but from the mid-1990s onwards especially has become an era of divergence and a period in which some cities are doing much better than others, and the ones who are doing best are, of course, those that are most globally connected. And the point of our paper, actually, was that outward foreign direct investment, we often talk in locational terms of the significance of contributions of inward investment, the spillovers, but outward direct investment by providing connectivity in the way I've just been suggesting to the outside world and increased or improved knowledge connectedness has significantly enhanced the innovative dynamism of some of the major cities, and hence we see this increased inequality as part of this picture. So Salma and I were therefore referring to patterns that we observed in patent data, US patent data, looking at the location of invention of inventors in the 62 largest, some of the 62 largest cities in the world across countries, including North America, Europe, Asia, and a few in Australasia or Latin America, 62 cities in all. And we use backward citations from the patents granted to inventors in those cities to identify spatial patterns of knowledge building, the kinds of profiles of knowledge on which they were drawing, using the location of the knowledge source represented by the cited patent and connecting that, as it were, to the knowledge recipient which subsequently invented other devices, artifacts, and so on that build upon the original knowledge that was sourced from elsewhere, or indeed in the same city, or elsewhere translocally, domestically, or internationally. These were the cities that we're talking about. It includes Madrid within Europe. It includes a number of major European cities, major American cities, and increasingly significant, as we'll see in a moment, a number of major Asian cities as well, including those of Japan, but also India and China. And so what we therefore observe in terms of the patent data, if we were to look either at the US or Europe, is a pattern pretty much like the diagram I showed you earlier on income inequality. That is to say, until around the early 1990s, we observe a kind of convergence across cities in terms of a catch-up process. So this is the coefficient of variation across cities, and therefore the extent of geographic concentration of activity in a particular place. So if this index goes down, it implies that activity is becoming more widespread across different places. But from the early 1990s onwards, we then observe, as we saw earlier with the income trends, the reverse. We see a divergence and a movement away, with some of the more larger successful cities pulling out. And what we found in terms of the detail, in terms of the JIBP paper, was that it was especially cities in the quartiles about sort of 60 to 80% richest cities that were doing best of all and most able to utilize outward direct investment and knowledge connectivity. However, one qualification is that if we then bring into this mix all the cities in the world, including particularly the Asian cities, we see almost the reverse pattern, and this is actually showing us that the Asian cities are catching up. So this is also familiar in a sense, and it is what we commonly observe, or we're aware of, that China, India, and even some of the cities of Japan have still been catching up. And this is therefore reflected in these data, which show the opposite trend of a divergence followed by a convergence meaning that there has not been the sort of diminution of inequality within countries, but that the Asian cities in particular have been catching up. So what we tried to do was then to say, well, what are the determinants of the innovativeness, or as Andrés was saying, the dynamism of these cities, locationally based? And we found that three particular factors mattered, although they mattered differently according to what regions of the world we were talking about. So first of all, complementarity between local and international knowledge networks. This is what I was speaking of earlier on, that this has, we've observed, mattered in terms of the ability of a city to connect its local cluster networks to international organizations. What we found was that this mattered, particularly in the earlier years, but not so much for the European cities, which have not been able to take advantage to the same extent as either the Asian or American cities of these international linkages. Although, of course, there have been some sort of more local linkages within Europe that have been important and increasingly important. We noted as well, and this was a kind of, the biggest impact of all was the geographic diversity of sources. So this in social network terms would be the centrality of a city, the extent to which a city is central to international knowledge network connections. This matters a great deal. So your ability to be able to span across a wider geographic range of knowledge sources gives you a big advantage. And we measured this by the change in the city's position in its centrality in the network, and we found that this mattered for cities in all regions, although less so for the Asian cities in the more recent times. And we inferred from that that this was an increasing kind of catch-up phenomenon that was occurring within, for example, China, India, or indeed Japan. Lastly, we looked at given that this is the information and digital age, innovative performance, the ability to establish ICT. And it's commonly observed, I think, among policymakers, Madam Vice President, I'm sure you'll be familiar with these discussions, that Europe has tended not to be doing so well and is worried about this in policy terms in ICT. And our data do tend to suggest just this, that the American and Asian cities, where they've acquired ICT capabilities, have been able to do much better in innovative dynamic terms. Much less so, unfortunately, for Europe, and perhaps this is, therefore, still of major policy concern here. So with some policy-related implications from all this, connecting back also to issues of sustainability, pandemic, and so on, Internationally connected cities, we argue, are at the forefront of innovation needed for sustainable development. This is why the kinds of devices that are needed, as it were, to move on from fossil fuels or the like are being developed. Battery development for efficient operation of miniaturized devices. So they have an important role to play from a policymaker's perspective. But connectivity to a greater diversity of sources is also vital because, and in other words, an open type of structure rather than techno-nationalism, as it were, because you need to increasingly access complex knowledge sources across space. So these kinds of interdependencies, both across fields and locations, have become increasingly significant. So we have to recognize that the major cities are wedded in a much wider global complex of relationships. But then we come, as it were, I think, to perhaps the most important policy conclusion here, which is that the capacity of these cities to, as it were, achieve this on behalf of their respective countries, especially within Europe, depends on investments in ICT, but also the renewal and re-establishment of relationships with the hinterlands, the sort of things that Andrés was describing in terms of some of the other areas in the vicinity of the city area, the metropolitan area, but also in the local community. So in New York terms, you know, other areas in upstate New York, parts of New Jersey. And likewise, you know, in Britain, it would be connections with other parts of, for example, southeast England or the northern part of England. And I'm sure there are similar stories that could be told in Spain. So these relationships, I think, become very important from a political point of view, in the sense that, as Andrés indicated earlier, there's been populist movements that have largely drawn on the kinds of resentment that have come from so-called urban elites. I've never entirely understood, actually, why somebody like Trump, who's much richer than me or than any of us, could pose as, you know, the enemy of the elites, and we're supposed to be the elites, the knowledge recipients of, you know, the knowledge base. But in fact, you know, this is a calculated attempt to designate those of us who do live in cities, urban areas, and so on, often, you know, with the intellectual and cultural pursuits that go with this, as a kind of removed elite. And we have to, I think, from a political or policy perspective, re-establish our connections with other communities to show that, you know, this is not a hostile culture, but this is a favorable culture, and to make linkages that would also be economically beneficial to those other places. And that, I think, is the crucial dilemma now, to re-establish those connections, drawing on the links that globally the major cities have. So not seeing globalization as the enemy, but as the friend also, potentially, not just of the major cities, but of other places too. So I think I will close on that note. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Vice President, Professor Rodríguez Pose, Professor Candwell. I have to say that I will invite the next 3 speakers in this opening plenary. The opening plenary it has, let's say, 2 parts because of COVID protocols. So not all of us could be seated in this table. So I could invite Mrs. Ana Cremades, please, to come into the scenario, as well as Mr. José Luis Curbelo and Mr. Fernando Salazar, who are in the first row. And 2 minutes to change the table, to clean the table, and we continue, and we will have the discussion after that, at the end. Thank you. hello again. After this small break to say goodbye to the Vice President too. We are still in our opening session, and now I have the pleasure to share this roundtable with three people who are doing public policy and doing the action in terms of the support to innovation policy in the Madrid region, on the one hand, also to make the support to the international firms, the Spanish international firms, and the cautions they face, and also from COFIDES, the link with international cooperation. So let me, first of all, to thank the three of them. And I would give the floor first to Ana Cremades, who is the General Director of Innovation for Madrid's regional government, who will speak on how regional authorities in this particular region, in Madrid, are dealing with the challenge that we mentioned in the first part of this opening plenary too, the challenge of improving science, because science we have seen quite relevant, important, determinant has been in this pandemic, and also R&D efforts, research and development in our region of Madrid. To face what? To face many challenges. One of them is climate change that invites to rapid technological innovation, but many others. So thank you very much, Ana Cremades, for staying here with us, for coming, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel, for your kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to Madrid on behalf of the regional government. I appreciate also the effort of promoting this kind of initiatives that bring together in Madrid, our region, the most relevant agents of the innovation and business ecosystem. This conference promotes the cooperation between different experts and contributes to the development of an innovative, knowledge-based, efficient regional ecosystem too, in which our universities and companies are two important stakeholders. Madrid, as you know, is a region that has all the necessary requirements to become a great innovation hub at a global level. Indeed, in the last report of innovations, Madrid is already considered a strong innovation region in Europe. We have a very dynamic and innovative companies of all sizes and sectors, which have the headquarters here located in our community, including 21 of the 35 IBEX companies. Our companies are in a well-connected region, in a strategic position of preferential link between Europe and other geographical areas like Latin America, but also Africa. We have a very advantageous tax system with investors attentive to innovation too. And we have leading universities and research institutes rising in international rankings and attracting talent and funding to develop excellent research and innovation projects. This is also very important, but we must also not forget that for innovation and for talent and to develop a science, it is also very important to have a critical mass. It's also for business the case. You need also a potential important market if you want to develop or locate your business somewhere. So we have also this potential market in the community of Madrid, and we only need to continue connecting all the initiatives of the different agents of our innovative system, like, for example, today with this conference, which is a very good initiative, to improve the position of our community as an innovative region. In Madrid, we have around 22% of the innovative companies in Spain, and we are also leading the number of patent applications filed with the Spanish Patent and Trademark Office. So we have the necessary requirements, but of course, our ecosystem also needs some help to develop, to improve, and to make more connections between them. From the Directorate General for Research and Innovation Technology, we have been supporting these efforts in innovation with different calls to help small, medium enterprises, startups, to promote liaison entities that coordinate networking, consortia, etc. And among them, I would like to highlight some of them. For example, we have what we call the innovation check that allows a small and medium-sized company to promote technological innovation by contracting actions, hiring some services with technology centers, universities, or research organizations, or through companies that provide also research and development services. On the other hand, we have also a cooperative call between entities. They can be public, private organizations of any kind, co-financed by the European Regional Development Fund to promote the transfer of technology to the productive sector through different actions as networking, training, promotion, etc. We have also a very important program, which is the Industrial Doctorate Program. This is an instrument to promote the research and professional career of doctorates inside the companies, to put their talent to work in the innovation, in the developments of these companies. Of course, we cannot forget the startups and also the small enterprises, small and medium enterprises with high innovative intensity, which lead some technological driven projects that we also support financially. And we made this also taking into account some very big companies, tractor companies in their sectors, which have projects including small companies, startups, and universities or research centers. So we are trying to focus the aim of the networking and that our projects can be developed in consortia with a more or a higher impact for all the stakeholders. We are also aware of the companies that are applying for the European Innovation Council, for the Accelerator Program. And these companies sometimes they meet all the criteria of the evaluation in Europe, but they cannot be recommended for funding, and they are awarded with a seal of excellence, and in the Comunidad de Madrid, then we fund these projects too. So we have many calls, many different supports for companies, but also we made a big stress not only in companies, but also to cover fundamental and applied issues of research in different fields, one of them also the social science, as well as promoting cooperation and collaboration between groups at the university, but seeking also for a partnership with different companies. Finally, I would like to stress that the regional government of Madrid is working to create the Madrid Startup Region program to reveal Madrid as a friendly region and a preferential place to start any business initiative with the best conditions for entrepreneurs and investors, providing multiple networking opportunities. Madrid is already a very strong innovator region, but needs even to grow more and to have more startups, new ideas, and more innovation. Taking the initiative to create a startup is not easy. Many doubts, many insecurities appear while trying for the best opportunities to develop one's ideas and to get this idea as a product or a service ready for the market. Therefore, there is a significant need of mentoring to guarantee the highest probabilities of success and consolidation and scale up of the startups. And that's why, for the Comunidad de Madrid, the mentoring is very important. We are putting also a focus on mentoring. The mentoring initiative should be formal, structured into a program with relevant, experienced mentors to rely on in the long run to guide the startups through the experience and sharing his or her own experience. And we make this through one of our foundations, which is the Foundation Madrid +D. Is our best tool to promote mentoring, to promote incubation of different startups, networking with a different focus in European programs. For example, we are also a local point for the Enterprise Europe network, and we are also developing other programs such as the incubators of the European Space Agency in Madrid, the Health Star Plus, and more. Of course, I think that the public administration should help companies. Many of the companies avoid to have any contact with the administration because it is a burden of administrative and paperwork, and sometimes the needs of the company are not adapted to the rhythm of the administration. So one of our focus now is also to simplify the administrative burden during the application, during the performance and monitoring of the grants that we are giving, and also to boost our regional plan for scientific research and technological innovation that is almost finished, and which we want to launch and to align with the strategy for smart and sustainable specialization of our region. We are taking into account of the challenge, climate, pollution, contamination, circular economy is also a very big area now in our focus. The Green Deal, the digital transformation, all of it is contained in our different calls and programs and initiatives. So in research, as in other innovative fields, we understand quite well the value of cooperation and collaboration and seeking for alliances and partnership. And we think that Madrid is really a very good place to get this connection, which can do a better world based also in our new economy, developing this ODS. So this conference is the best opportunity to develop your ideas, sharing your experiences and good practices, and providing a solid network for it. So I wish you all a nice and fruitful conference, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ana Cremades, General Director of Innovation for Madrid's regional government. And now I would invite Mr. José Luis Curbelo, President of COFIDES, will share some thoughts, his thoughts, on the relationship already established in the public support that in Spain, and particularly through COFIDES, is given to the private sector through our international cooperation aid, particularly from a European perspective and a strategy. And of course, as with the other, thank you much for coming, and the floor is yours. Please.
¿Cómo se...? Hello, thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting meeting. And I congratulate you for your bravery in keeping on with the meeting in a situation in which there was a lot of uncertainty regarding traveling and regarding the possibilities of having these meetings. I think that meeting all of us here is a good idea, especially we are talking about academia, in which academia is something in which closeness is very important, because all of us, or all of you, need to be in touch with each other. The name of my presentation is going to be Private and Public Cooperation for Sustainable Development. First of all, I would like to talk about what is COFIDES, what is the organization which I represent, and why I talk about this issue of private and public cooperation within the framework of Sustainable Development Goals from the institutional perspective of the institution which I represent. Later on, I will make some reference to the relevance of private sector in economic development, in development finance, and I will talk about the need to build ecosystems for development, international development. I hope that this contribution will help to enrich the reflection about the necessary dialogue and cooperation of the public and private sectors. And I will also add the philanthropy, the whole world of philanthropy and NGOs, should we want to promote sustainable development as epitomized by the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, if we are aiming to fulfill the Paris Agreement objectives on climate change, and we could help also, we could help add right now how we strengthen our commitment, especially the commitment of developed countries with the problems that are consequence of COVID-19 in developing countries. COFIDES is the Spanish member of the European Development Finance Association, and is also a part of the Spanish and European Architecture for Economic Development. There are other institutions. Later on, we'll talk my friend Fernando from CESCE, but also the Spanish Agency for International Development, ICO, that is the big public bank of Spain, the NGOs, as I said before, lots of other actors that are somehow the ecosystem for economic development in developing countries. The company itself, COFIDES, works all along three pillars. One of them is supporting the internationalization of Spanish companies in other countries. The second one is supporting the Spanish policy for international cooperation. And the other is, and this is brand new, and probably all of you that are from Spain, or many of you that are from Spain know about, we are the institutions that has been appointed by the government to manage recapitalization fund for Spanish companies affected by COVID. The first two lines of activity, internationalization and development, are is to operate outside Spain. The last one is to operate in Spain. A particular characteristic of all EDFI members, as I said, the EDFI is the association of Spanish European agencies similar to COFIDES. All countries have an institution like that. DEG in Germany, Proparco in France, or whatever. All countries have an institution like that. All of us share a vision of aligning of our activities in supporting the private sector to support the fulfillment of the 2030 agenda and the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals as were defined by the 2030 agenda. All of us, of course, are committed with putting forward the agenda, knowing that our main interlocutor is always the private sector. Over the past 20 years, and I think it's very important to have in mind the time reference, over the past 20 years, there has been a change in the financing of development. Before, practically all development aid, all the support to development in developing countries was something that were committed either by the multilateral development banks or by the governments. During the last 20, I would say 15 or even less than that, the situation has changed dramatically. We have to keep in mind the year 2015. The year 2015, there were two events that were important. On the one hand was the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals definition, and the other was the Paris Agreement. And one of the key elements in these activities, in these two international agreements, was giving an important role to the private sector. So before, all the issues related with development were something of interest practically in exclusivity for the public sector, while if we want to achieve the development goals and if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement, we have to involve other actors that basically is the private sector that was underutilized until that moment. And the private sector at that time was at the most the one that implemented activities that were financed by the public sector. The name of the game at that time in the Agenda 2030, the commercial name for all of that was something that probably many of you have heard, that is, we have to move from the billions to the trillions of dollars devoted to economic development in developing countries. And according to recent data, the gap, the yearly gap in financing for the Sustainable Development Goals achievement is, the yearly gap is of around $3 trillion. So these $3 trillion have to be fulfilled, have to be satisfied by mobilizing the private sector in investing in development. Mobilization then of private sector is a real challenge for public institutions, and including development banks, agencies, NGOs, all the people that somehow participate in this business. Institutions have to evolve from something that was the general tradition. All the banks, or the public development banks, or all the multilateral development banks generally had products that were general products. Generally was lending to countries so that countries made the reforms or they invest in projects. Right now, if we want to mobilize the private sector, we have to structure tailor-made structures that are capable to mobilize the interests of the private sector in order to participate in projects that, while they consider of interest for them, they perceive risks that are not acceptable or are not manageable for the private sector itself. So the new concept here during the last 20 years, and especially during the last 5-6 years, is the concept of blending. How you blend resources coming from different origins, coming from different institutions that have different tolerance to risk and are looking for different returns or satisfaction of their interest. So here is wherever we have that money is very important, but the other important thing is how you structure operations so that you leverage public money with private money in order to satisfy the development needs that countries have in order to satisfy the sustainable development goals that we have already defined as common goals for the humanity. Here is where official development agencies, the traditional cooperation agencies, have a real problem. And is that while the monies for official development assistance, the so-called ODA, has been at the most steady and recently declining a little bit, the participation of development finance institutions like COFIDES, the one that participate trying to mobilize the resources of the private sector, are increasing by a rate of 10% a year. Actually, most European governments have been financing institutions, I will say like COFIDES, but I will say other members of the EDFI, in order to be able to structure operations so that if we continue like today, the annual level of investment of the EDFIs amount to $8 billion. If we continue growing at this 10% a year that we are growing, in a couple of years, 3 years, probably 4 or 5 years, the amount of money of official development aid will be exactly the same that the one that is allocated from institutions like this one, the European Development Financial Institutions, to leverage public money. This is the only way to close the gap that we have been talking before about the 3 trillion a year that are necessary to direct to developing countries. Today, for instance, this type of institutions amount to 70% of the money that is invested with the private sector in developing countries. But here is only a description of data, a description of tendencies. Here is what we have to do internally. What institutions have to do internally, both us and other institutions, development banks, that are investing in development. It's already, I have the feeling that every time that economists and economists interested in development meet together, all of us talk about ecosystems. It's the buzzword that is the solution, like structural change was 20 years ago. Now everything is building ecosystems. But it's a reality. We have to build ecosystems to foster a proactive external engagement of all actors for a common purposes. First of all, we have to have a common playing field. As you know, there is a big greenwashing type of activities. Even you find that all of activities that have been devoted for many years to oil and similar like that, they are today the greenest companies in the world, worldwide. On the other hand, we have to have measures in order to know how much money we allocate to development and how much money we allocate to solve development goals that we have defined. And we have especially, and I will say, and I will emphasize, that the purpose of institutions like us is trying to mobilize the so-called patient capital. Patient capital is today those segments of capital that are not looking for the short-term return. Institutional investors, for instance, pension funds, all of them are big investors, they have the big money, and they need to invest in long-term projects. Of course, you have to de-risk the investment so that you need to cope with public support all the risks that are perceived by investing in certain countries, by investing in certain sectors, or by investing in certain group of peoples or economic activities. So institutional investors is some group of bunch of capital and a bunch of resources that is important to mobilize. So here is where I somehow defend, and this is the full purpose of the presentation of the paper, is that development banks and institutions like us, we have to develop our ability to blend resources and resources that have different origins. In the case of Europe, for instance, with a lot of money, I will say that the budget for development in third world countries had been multiplied by 7 for the next economic period. So we have to be able to utilize that money to leverage the participation of private sector in closing the gap for financing. Here again, the issue is how you de-risk countries, how you de-risk sectors, actors, and main of all, perceptions. For many of you know, for instance, many years ago, there was the perception that microfinance was a very dangerous and very risky investment. Today is the common standard has been shown that microfinance is a very safe and very lucrative investment for investors, while at the same time may have a lot of impact in poverty alleviation and in the development of entrepreneurship in developing countries. So here is where institutions like us have to be able to structure tailor-made solutions aiming to cope with specific sustainable development goals. As a conclusion, I will say the achievement of the goals that we have ahead, including the Paris Agreement goals, requires the active involvement of private sector and philanthropic actors beside the public sector. We have to be able to mobilize them. Public sector has to be able to mobilize private sector in developing blending structures. My experience, and this is my personal experience after many years working in development, in multilateral development banks and public development banks, is that while these institutions are very good to finance public governments and to provide technical assistance to governments for regulatory frameworks or frameworks for the development of different activities, they are not good at developing tailor-made projects that have to consider the different risks involved in any operation and have to be able to mobilize resources from different origins. So this implies, besides money, knowledge, time, and the ability to put together a lot of actors. Thank you very much. Please keep safe while here in Spain and enjoy the country and enjoy being with each other, that I think is something essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, José Luis, for being here, for supporting also this conference. And I would like to invite now Mr. Fernando Salazar. Mr. Fernando Salazar is the president of CESCE. CESCE is the Spanish company on assurance and caution to export. So it is an institution very involved with the internationalization of firms, and they are doing an important emphasis on the sustainable development action. So please, thank you very much for coming, Fernando, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a proof of the commitment that CESCE has with the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all. I'm well aware it's Friday afternoon, I'm the last speaker, so I will be as short and concrete as possible. We are supposed to talk about public support to the private sector, and I believe CESCE is a great example of that. Why? Because we are both public and private. 50.2% of CESCE belongs to the Ministry of Finance. 49.8% of CESCE belongs to a different set of banks and insurance companies. We have a private business where we insure, in the credit insurance business, we insure invoices from companies up to, this year is going to be 50 billion euro, 50,000 million euro, which is not bad. And we are also a public company. We are the Spanish Export Credit Agency, ECA. We are similar to COFAS in France, now BPI, similar to SACE in Italy, to Euler Hermes in Germany, to Atradius in the Netherlands, for instance. There, our portfolio is 17 billion euro in insurance all over the world, mostly in developing countries, mostly in emerging countries. But we are also the owners of Informa. Informa is the main information company in the Spanish economy, belongs to the worldwide network of Dun & Bradstreet. And to give you an example, they have information of 400 million companies all around the world, which they update 385 million times a day, every day, 385 million updates on the information that we hold. No? What can we do to support the private sector? Well, we can do many things. We can do, governments do policies. We can implement those policies. We will come up with products, with specific products. We can also lead by example, which is also very important. One of the things I have been most proud in the almost 4 years I've been in CESCE is once that a chairman of a big financial institution in Spain called me, and he told me, I've been asking around who is the leader in sustainable development goals in the financial sector in Spain, and everybody has told me about you, and I would like to have a meeting with you and know what you are doing. So that made me proud. No? So we can also lead by example. No? CESCE took a decision in 2017, 4 or 5 years ago, which is to allocate 0.7% of our net profits to corporate social responsibility, which we do every year consistently. Lately, we're doing it cooperatively. The employees propose the projects, and it's a committee of employees, the ones that approve the projects. And we work with many sectors, with many NGOs in the Spanish and international economy. To give you some examples, in Sustainable Development Goal number 3, in the health sector, we promote many initiatives, mainly related to rare diseases, related to cancer investigation, research, but the entire industry, the entire insurance industry, we created a policy, an insurance policy for the doctors and the nurses that took care of us during COVID. It has been the largest collective insurance policy in Spanish history. It has been promoted by the whole sector, by Mutua Madrileña, by Mafre, by CESCE, by Atradius, by everyone in the sector. And we took care of the people that were taking care of us. It was a health and life insurance policy. In SDG number 5, in gender, we do all kinds of things, but the most significant one is that CESCE is the 5th company in Spain in the whole insurance industry with most females in our board of directors. 47% of our board of directors are women, which is not normal in our sector. 44% of the companies do not have a single woman in the board of directors, and the average is 15%. We work a lot with the industry in SDG number 9. That's our main goal, promoting industries. In COVID, we came up with a 3 billion euro line of credit implemented in 2 stages. We have supported 1,719 Spanish exporting companies that, to a certain point of view, we have ensured their survivability. during COVID. We have done all kinds of things. We are very famous for being the insurer of the Spanish companies that built the Panama Canal, or being the insurer of the Spanish companies that have built the high-speed train between La Meca and Medina and Saudi Arabia. But people forget that we have 140,000 customers and 139,000 RSMEs. We support all kinds of customers, all kinds of companies. We have created new products, one for startups, which is very innovative in the industry. No one insures in startups. We are insuring startups. We started this month of June with a company created by a woman in a small village in Galicia. That was our first customer. We do B2B business now. We are starting this month of December to insert in B2B platforms an insurance product to ensure that people that sell in this kind of platforms get paid. And we are starting around the 20th of December. We will launch it. We provide liquidity to small and medium companies. We not only insure the invoices, we pay them. And we pay them in an average of 0.43 days. That means less than half a day. And we take the whole risk of that invoice. So we do a lot of things in SDG number 9. But the last one, and the one I want to rely on, to focus on, is SDG number 13, climate. We are a company that have, along its history, insure a lot of projects in the oil and gas sector. Yes, we have done it. We have done a very concrete set of projects, oil refineries, to produce the latest technologies in gasolines in developing countries that do not normally have that kind of technology, but we have done it. We have signed, the government of Spain, a few days ago, November 9th, in Glasgow conference, that we are no longer going to insure or finance this kind of products, this kind of projects, and we will do it. We are negotiating the small details, but we will no longer do it. We, as a company, the last 2 years, we have been fully certified as not polluting a single gram of CO2. We were issuing around 400 tons a year, 430 tons in 2016 as a company. Last year, we did 144 tons, 1/3, and all of them we compensate with reforestation projects in burn mountains in Spain. And 2019, 2020, not a single gram of CO2 to the atmosphere, fully certified. And we are coming up with new green policies that will go to the market this month or next month for insuring credits that go to environmental projects fully certified by the European Union according to EU taxonomy. And there the multiplier effect, where the public policy can have an impact in the private sector, can be tremendous. So far, we have done 2.8 billion in green products. With the traditional products, with the new products, it will be much more. So far, we have insured 29 billion euros in green projects accomplished by Spanish companies all over the world. So, giving you some concrete examples in the things that we are doing in our responsibility, in our social corporate responsibility, in our products, in our policies, I believe we can certainly have an impact, and we can certainly lead by example the transformation of our economy to a greener economy, as the Vice President said. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for bearing with me at this time of the day. And thanks a lot for inviting us.
So again, thank you very much for all your support, for being our sponsors of this conference. And the conference is officially opened. Now we have to go to our welcome reception at the Museo del Traje. It's 5-minute walking from here. So let's go and enjoy the next 2 days of discussions, paper presentation, panels, and so on. Thank you.